When Karen White, the HOA chairwoman, declared John Matthews' backyard community property, she was sure he wouldn't fight back. Dismissing his protests with arrogance, she thought her fabricated documents and unchecked authority would keep her safe. But Karen underestimated John. With ironclad evidence and unshakable resolve, he took a stand. What followed exposed not just her lies, but a scandal that rocked the entire community. And it all started here. John Matthews, an experienced engineer and a proud veteran, lived in a home he considered his fortress of peace. This cozy house, surrounded by a tall wooden fence, was his pride and joy. The backyard held a special place in his heart. It was where he hosted warm evening barbecues with friends and enjoyed tranquil morning walks with his loyal Labrador Baxter. Every tree and flower bed was a living memory of his parents, who had passed the house down to him. But everything changed one fateful morning. As John stepped outside to breathe in the crisp air, he noticed something unusual at the edge of his property. A new sign had been installed, one he was certain hadn't been there before. Bold letters stared back at him. Community property, HOA, private land. At first, he thought it was a mistake, perhaps even a prank. But the longer he stared at the sign, the more unease crept into his chest. No one had notified him of any changes, let alone asked for his permission. Who could have done this without consulting him? Determined to get answers, John went about his day until he crossed paths with Karen White, the chairwoman of the HOA, a woman notorious for her domineering attitude. Karen, seemingly anticipating this encounter, approached him with unwavering confidence. "John, you need to understand," she began without preamble. "We've decided that your backyard is now part of the community space." John froze for a moment, disbelief etched across his face. His backyard? His private property? How could she possibly think she had the authority to make such a declaration? "Excuse me, Karen, but you must be mistaken," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "This land belongs to me, and I have the legal documents to prove it." Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out a stack of papers from her bag and waved them in front of him with an air of self-assured superiority. "This decision was made in the best interest of the community," she continued. "We're planning to install picnic tables and a playground here. It's all perfectly legal." John's pulse quickened as a wave of anger surged through him. Documents? What documents? No one had asked his permission, let alone informed him of such plans. He tried to argue, to point out the illegality of such actions, but Karen interrupted him with a dismissive tone. "John, you need to think about the bigger picture here. This isn't just about you, it's about what's best for everyone in the neighborhood. Surely you want our community to thrive, don't you?" Her words were coated with a thin veneer of condescension, as though she were speaking to a selfish child who didn't understand the greater good. John could feel his frustration bubbling over, his fists clenching at his sides as he struggled to remain calm. Later that evening, he sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at his cooling cup of coffee. His gaze drifted to the window, where he could see the backyard, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary. Now, it felt like the site of an impending battle. How could this happen? He thought, his mind racing. No one has the right to take what's mine without even asking. It's outrageous. It was in that moment, as the quiet resolve settled over him, that John decided he wouldn't let this go. He knew that taking on the HOA would be no small task, especially with someone like Karen at the helm. But for the sake of his home, the memory of his parents, and the principle of justice, he was ready to fight back. Karen didn't stop. Within days, John noticed a group of workers entering his backyard with tools and measuring equipment. They began marking the ground, speaking amongst themselves and gesturing at the space as if they owned it. John's blood boiled as he stormed outside to confront them. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice firm but controlled. "This is my property. Who gave you permission to do this?" One of the workers, a middle-aged man in a neon vest, paused and looked at him with a mixture of discomfort and indifference. "We're here on orders from the HOA, the man replied with a shrug, as if that explained everything. "We've been told this is a community project, so we're setting up for a playground installation." John felt a surge of frustration. "This is a violation of the law," he exclaimed, pointing to the clear boundary markers on the ground. "You can't just waltz onto my land and start digging." But the workers simply exchanged glances and shrugged again. One of them muttered, "We're just doing our job," before turning back to his clipboard. Their casual dismissal of his protest left John standing there, feeling powerless and enraged. That evening, Karen escalated her campaign. She sent out a mass email to all the neighborhood residents, painting John as an uncooperative, selfish individual who was blocking a project meant to benefit the community. In the email, she described him as someone who refuses to share and accused him of being hostile toward the HOA's initiatives. The fallout was immediate. Some neighbors started giving John cold looks as he walked Baxter around the block. Others whispered behind his back, clearly influenced by Karen's narrative. Yet, not everyone bought into her story. A few neighbors approached John privately, expressing their support and sharing their own grievances about the HOA's overreach. "You're not alone in this," one neighbor, a soft-spoken retiree named Linda, told him. "Karen's been doing this kind of thing for years, but most of us are too scared to stand up to her. You're the first person who's actually trying." Hearing this only strengthened John's resolve. He realized that Karen wasn't just targeting him. She was leveraging her position to control and intimidate the entire neighborhood. Something had to be done. John's first step was to consult a lawyer. He needed to understand exactly what his rights were and how far the HOA's authority extended. The attorney confirmed what John had suspected. Karen was exploiting a loophole in the HOA's recently amended bylaws, which allowed them to claim certain properties as community spaces under specific conditions. However, this loophole didn't apply to privately owned land with clear documentation, like John's backyard. Armed with this knowledge, John began digging through his records. He found the original deed to his property, complete with clear boundaries that had been legally established decades ago. He also started gathering photographic evidence of his yard, showing its long-standing use as private property. John didn't stop there. He reached out to other neighbors who had confided in him, asking if they had faced similar issues with Karen or the HOA. Their stories poured in: unfair fines, sudden rule changes, and even threats of legal action. It became clear that Karen's behavior wasn't just a one-time overreach, it was part of a pattern. As the days passed, John began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The initial frustration and helplessness were giving way to determination. He wasn't just fighting for his backyard anymore. He was standing up for himself, his neighbors, and the principle that no one should be allowed to abuse their authority unchecked. Still, he couldn't shake the weight of the situation. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee and looked out at his backyard, now dotted with the bright orange markers left by the workers, he felt a pang of anxiety. This isn't just about the yard, he thought. It's about what's right. If I let them win, what's to stop them from doing this to someone else? John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen had influence, resources, and a network of supporters willing to turn a blind eye to her actions. But he also knew that truth and persistence were powerful weapons, and he was ready to wield them. The HOA meeting was held in a modest community center, with rows of folding chairs arranged under the flickering fluorescent lights. John entered the room, carrying a folder packed with documents, his jaw set with determination. The quiet murmur of neighbors filled the air, but all conversation ceased as Karen White took her place at the front. Her confident demeanor and firm voice commanded attention, but John knew he couldn't let that intimidate him. When the time came for public comments, John rose from his seat. All eyes turned to him as he made his way to the front, his footsteps echoing off the tile floor. Setting his folder on the table, he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment was palpable. "I'm here to address a serious issue regarding my property. My backyard, my private land, has been unlawfully claimed as community property by the HOA." Gasps rippled through the room. John opened his folder and displayed copies of his deed, clearly showing the boundaries of his property. "These documents," he said, holding them up, "prove without a doubt that my backyard is private property. It's not, and never has been, part of the HOA's jurisdiction." The audience leaned in, their interest piqued. Even some of Karen's staunchest supporters appeared unsettled by the evidence, but Karen was not one to back down easily. Rising from her chair, she waved a stack of papers in response. "Those documents are outdated, John," she said with a tight smile. We've made updates to the HOA bylaws that clearly include your property within the community space. This was done legally and with the best interests of the neighborhood in mind. John could feel his pulse quicken. Then show me the legal documentation proving that, he countered. Karen motioned to a man seated nearby, whom she introduced as our legal advisor. The man, a distant relative of Karen's, stepped forward, fumbling with a briefcase. As he began to speak, it became apparent to everyone in the room that he was ill-prepared. His vague answers and inability to produce valid legal documentation raised more questions than they answered. Whispers spread through the audience as doubt crept into their minds. But John wasn't finished. He had anticipated Karen's tactics and had taken precautions. Just days earlier, he had installed surveillance cameras around his property to monitor any further encroachments. What those cameras captured shocked even him. "If my documents aren't enough," John said, his voice growing stronger, "then let me show you what's really been happening." He connected his laptop to the projector, and the room fell silent as footage from the cameras began to play. The video clearly showed Karen herself entering John's backyard late one evening, dismantling a section of his fence. The evidence was irrefutable. Murmurs turned to outright exclamations of disbelief. "She took down his fence," one neighbor whispered. "This is unbelievable," another muttered, shaking their head. Karen's confident facade faltered. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, John delivered the final blow. "I've already called the police to document this, and they've discovered even more." The room went quiet again as John explained what the police investigation had uncovered. Karen had forged documents to expand the HOA's boundaries, blatantly falsifying signatures and bypassing the legal requirement to notify residents of changes to the bylaws. Her scheme was as reckless as it was dishonest, and now it was unraveling before her eyes. For a moment, Karen stood frozen at the front of the room. The weight of her actions, exposed so publicly, seemed to press down on her. The attendees began to murmur louder, many now openly criticizing her. "She crossed the line," one neighbor said, their voice tinged with anger. "Who else has she done this to?" Karen, visibly shaken, attempted to regain control. "I was only trying to help the community," she stammered, her voice losing its usual authority. But the damage was done. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached John, shaking his hand and thanking him for standing up to the HOA's abuse of power. Others left in a hurry, their trust in Karen shattered. For John, the battle wasn't over, but this victory was a turning point. He walked out of the community center that night, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The truth was out, and now it was only a matter of time before justice followed. The courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation as people took their seats, the soft murmur of whispers rippling through the crowd. John Matthews sat at the plaintiff's table, a quiet resolve in his posture. In front of him was a neatly arranged stack of documents and evidence, each piece meticulously prepared. On the other side of the room, Karen White sat stiffly, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous edge. It was clear she felt the weight of the moment. As the judge entered, the room fell silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The proceedings began, and John's attorney wasted no time in presenting the evidence. First came the documents, the original deed to John's property, survey maps clearly marking the boundaries, and a timeline of HOA's overreach. The facts were irrefutable. The courtroom screens flickered to life as the next piece of evidence was displayed, the surveillance footage. The audience watched in stunned silence as Karen appeared on the screen, dismantling a section of John's fence under the cover of night. The video left no room for doubt, and the room erupted into murmurs. Karen's attorney attempted to downplay the footage, but it was a losing battle. When John's neighbors were called to the stand, their testimonies painted an even grimmer picture of Karen's actions. One neighbor spoke of the relentless pressure she placed on residents, another detailed the questionable fines imposed by the HOA, and others corroborated John's story about Karen's campaign to paint him as a villain in the neighborhood. Finally, it was Karen's turn to speak. She stood and tried to maintain her composure, delivering a shaky defense about acting in the community's best interest. Her arguments were vague and unconvincing, especially when cross-examined. "Mrs. White, John's attorney asked, holding up a forged document. "Can you explain why the signature on this so-called updated boundary agreement doesn't match Mr. Matthews' legal signature?" Karen hesitated, the color draining from her face. "It must be a clerical error," she mumbled, avoiding eye contact. The judge raised an eyebrow, his disapproval evident. "A clerical error does not explain the deliberate actions captured on video," he said sternly. As the evidence mounted, Karen's defense crumbled. It was clear to everyone in the room that her actions had not only been unethical, but blatantly illegal. The judge leaned forward, his tone decisive. "The court finds that Karen White knowingly falsified documents to expand the HOA's boundaries and violated private property laws. The evidence also shows a clear pattern of misconduct that cannot be ignored." He paused, glancing at Karen, before continuing. "Mrs. White, you are ordered to compensate Mr. Matthews for all legal fees and an additional amount for emotional distress caused by your actions. The forged documents are hereby declared null and void. Furthermore, the HOA is fined for violating property laws and is required to undergo an audit to ensure compliance with all regulations moving forward." The gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, but for Karen, the ordeal was far from over. As John gathered his documents, relieved and victorious, whispers began circulating about the pending police investigation. What had started as a property dispute had uncovered a much larger web of corruption. The financial audit revealed that Karen had been misusing HOA funds for years, channeling money into personal expenses disguised as community projects. The fallout was swift. Karen resigned from her position under immense pressure, her reputation in tatters. The HOA was forced to implement new measures to ensure transparency, and many residents, inspired by John's courage, began voicing their own grievances. For John, the victory was bittersweet. He had fought tirelessly to protect what was his, and in doing so, he had exposed the deeper issues plaguing the neighborhood. Standing in his backyard that evening, with the fence restored and the peace of his sanctuary intact, he felt a sense of closure. This wasn't just about me, he thought, watching Baxter run happily across the grass. It was about standing up for what's right, and sometimes that's the hardest fight of all. The story of John Matthews became a rallying cry for others facing similar injustices, a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of fighting for what truly matters. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of change, both for John Matthews and the entire neighborhood. Karen White, once the seemingly untouchable chairwoman of the HOA, submitted her resignation. Her confident facade had crumbled, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. The HOA, under new leadership, made a public commitment to transparency and collaboration with residents. They announced plans to overhaul their bylaws, ensuring no homeowner would ever have to endure what John had faced. John, however, was focused on restoring normalcy. His backyard, once a battleground for property rights, now felt like a sanctuary again. Over a weekend, with the help of a few supportive neighbors, he rebuilt the fence that had been torn down. Each hammer strike felt cathartic, a tangible way to reclaim his space and his peace. Baxter, his ever-faithful Labrador, playfully ran along the newly restored perimeter, his wagging tail a reminder of the simple joys that made this home worth fighting for. As John stood back to admire the finished fence, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree at the edge of his property. He smiled, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lift. His home was his again, not just physically, but emotionally. The fear, frustration, and anger had been replaced with a quiet pride. This is what victory feels like, he thought. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever had to stand up to something bigger than themselves. John's story didn't end in his backyard. Word of his battle spread quickly throughout the community and beyond. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as an inspiring tale of perseverance and justice. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak out began sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. John became something of a local hero, a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. During a televised interview, John sat calmly in front of the cameras, his demeanor modest but resolute. "This victory isn't just mine," he told the reporter, his voice steady. "It's proof that no one is above the law. We all have a right to protect what's ours, and we shouldn't be afraid to stand up for those rights." The words resonated far beyond the immediate community. Emails and letters poured in from homeowners in similar situations, thanking John for showing them that it was possible to fight back. His story ignited a ripple effect, inspiring others to challenge unfair practices in their own neighborhoods. For the HOA, the changes were just beginning. The new leadership, eager to rebuild trust, held open forums where residents could voice their concerns and propose solutions. Projects were now subject to community votes, and financial transparency became a cornerstone of their operations. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to heal, its residents finding common ground in the shared goal of creating a fair and welcoming community. As for John, he returned to his routines, though his life would never quite be the same. His backyard once again became a place of joy, where friends gathered for barbecues and laughter echoed under the setting sun. Baxter, as always, was at his side, chasing after a frisbee or lounging in the shade of the oak tree. On one particularly quiet evening, as John watched the stars from his porch, a neighbor stopped by. It was Linda, the retiree who had supported him from the beginning. "You did something incredible, John," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "You didn't just win for yourself. You gave all of us hope." John smiled, his heart full. "It was the right thing to do," he replied simply. The victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was a reminder that fairness and justice are worth pursuing, no matter the odds. John's journey proved that even the most determined opposition can be overcome with courage, evidence, and the support of a community. In the end, John's fight left an undeniable mark. His story was a beacon of hope, a testament to the idea that one person's determination can spark change. It reminded everyone who heard it that standing up for your rights isn't just about protecting what's yours, it's about showing others that they can do the same. And for John, that was the most rewarding outcome of all.